The wind swept across the plains like a memory too stubborn to fade. Dust curled in long ribbons down the main street of Dry Creek, brushing past boots and wagon wheels, whispering against the porch rails of the town's quiet buildings. Nothing moved fast in Dry Creek, not time, not grief, not the people who carried it in their bones. Thomas Lorne sat with his back to the sun, the brim of his hat casting a long shadow down his weathered face. His coat was patched, his boots dull with years, but his posture, rigid, thoughtful, held the weight of someone who had once believed in something. Now he believed only in silence. 2 winters ago, that silence had swallowed his wife in a fevered breath, and since then it had taken up residence in his home and in his chest. The townsfolk had their way of treating a widower. Courteous, brief. A nod at the post office. A word at the saloon. No one asked if he ate. No one asked if he slept. He wasn't feared, just passed over like a book long closed. He wasn't supposed to be in town that day. The sun was too high, the heat too tight around the neck. But his horse had thrown a shoe on the eastern ridge, and Dry Creek was the closest place to find iron and hands to shape it. It was then that he heard the voice, loud, nasal, cracking through the hush like a whip. Step right up, gentlemen, for the final offering of the day. 19 years and full of fire. Raised frontier tough, no city soft in this one. Keep her fed and she'll outlast your cattle. A crowd had gathered at the edge of town square. Men in wide hats and spurs leaned on fence rails or shifted in the dust. Thomas approached not out of interest, but instinct, drawn by something that churned in his chest like the wind before storm. She stood on a crate, barefoot, ankles bruised, hair in a rough braid, a thin shawl slipping down one shoulder. Her face was unreadable. Not proud, not afraid, just still. The kind of stillness found in wild animals, poised, waiting to see which way the danger would break. She was young, yes, but not a child. Not the kind of young that fluttered or smiled with ease. There was hardness in the curve of her mouth, in the quiet way her eyes searched the crowd and found no one worth looking at. Thomas watched her for a long moment. He didn't think of his wife. He didn't think of loneliness. What he thought was this: she should not be standing there, half-priced and burning under men's eyes. The bidding began, sluggish. A man offered $3 and a lamb. Another chuckled and upped it to $4 and a jug of corn whiskey. One barked, "Don't need her to talk, just work." The crowd laughed. The girl didn't blink. Thomas stepped forward, his voice low, steady. $6 and a saddle blanket. She leaves with me now. Silence dropped like a stone. The auctioneer paused. "Well now, Mr. Lorne, we weren't sure you'd." "She leaves with me," Thomas said again. Not louder, just final. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clapped his hands. "Sold, then. To Mr. Lorne of Cold Hill Road. Judge Weller's, just down the way if you're looking to make it official." Thomas turned. "I am." She climbed down from the crate without help. Didn't look at the men, didn't look at Thomas. Just walked, slow and barefoot, behind him like the earth didn't hurt anymore. At the courthouse, the judge raised a brow, but said nothing. The marriage was written, witnessed, by 2 clerks who barely looked up from their ledgers. Thomas signed his name with the same hand that had once planted corn and held his dying wife's wrist. The girl signed hers, Maybelline. They left the courthouse at dusk. The sun hung low and red, like an old scar glowing at the edge of the world. Thomas led his horse by the reins. Maybelline walked beside him, arms folded. He offered her the saddle. She refused it. She didn't speak until they reached the edge of town. "You don't have to touch me." He looked at her then, and saw not defiance, but a truth stated plain, like weather or firewood. "I won't," he said. "Not unless you ask." She nodded once. They walked the rest of the way without speaking, the sky bruising into stars overhead. At the cabin, he opened the door and stepped back to let her in first. The room smelled faintly of old cedar and dried herbs. It was clean, not because he was tidy, but because it had stopped being lived in. Nothing was out of place. Nothing dared. Maybelline paused just inside, her eyes scanning the room. She did not ask whose shawl lay across the rocking chair, or why the bed was still made untouched, beneath a quilt that bore the shape of two ghosts. He showed her the water basin, the cupboard, the hearth. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep here by the fire." She nodded. No thanks. No softness. That night, Thomas lay on the rug with his boots beside him, and the fire casting long shadows up the log walls. He listened to the wind move across the roof, listened to the small creak of boards as Maybelline walked the room, learning its boundaries. He did not sleep. He did not expect to. In the morning, she was already outside, standing at the edge of the pasture. The sun had not yet risen fully, but the earth was beginning to glow in that pink-gold hush that came before heat. She held something in her hand, a clump of wildflowers, dirt still clinging to the roots. Prairie daisies. Hardy things. Survivors. He approached her quietly. "I thought they'd all died," he said. "They do. Then they come back." She did not look at him when she said it, just stooped down and pressed the flowers into the soil by the fence post, patting the dirt around them like she'd done it 1,000 times before. He watched her for a long time. She was not afraid of the land. She was not afraid of him. And for the first time since he buried his wife beneath the cottonwood tree, he felt something stir beneath the grief. Not joy. Not yet. But the space where it might grow, if given time. She looked up at him then, dirt on her fingers, sunlight caught in her lashes. "We'll need more seeds," she said, "if we're to eat come fall." And just like that, the bargain had changed. She wasn't there to be kept. She was there to begin again. Thomas nodded. "There's a ledger in town. We can ride in tomorrow." She rose, brushing her hands against her dress, and turned back toward the cabin. He followed, 2 steps behind, and the prairie wind carried their silence forward like a promise. Behind them, the flowers swayed. Not beautiful, but alive. The marriage certificate lay folded in the drawer beneath a tin of nails and old tobacco, filed away like a receipt for something quietly purchased, but never spoken of again. There had been no wedding supper, no lace, no dance. Only dust and sun and the hush of a preacher's breath as he'd mumbled through the words that bound a stranger to another stranger before the day turned to dusk. Maybelline moved through the cabin as if it weren't hers, but wasn't quite foreign either. She cleaned without being asked, rearranged nothing. Her presence settled like mist, there, but not pressing. In the mornings, Thomas heard her stir before the rooster, the soft clink of water ladled from the basin, the creak of the door as she stepped barefoot onto the porch to watch the hills wake. She took the bed because he told her to, and she made it each morning so tightly that the covers looked like they belonged to someone else entirely. Thomas never entered the room. She left the door cracked open, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps by accident, but he never looked in. He cooked badly, and she ate what he made without comment. Salted beans, dry bread, boiled eggs, so overdone the yolks had gone gray. When she began leaving a small tin of herbs near the stove, he said nothing, but used them. They lived not as man and wife, but as 2 people learning how to walk through the same silence. Once he found her on her knees in the yard, hands buried deep in the soil near the porch. She was planting something, green shoots from a pouch she'd kept tucked in her satchel. "What is it?" he asked. "Carrots," she said, not looking up. He wanted to tell her the ground here was mean, that he'd tried once to grow beets, and they'd come up twisted and bitter. But he said nothing. She already knew the land could be cruel. She still chose to plant. That night, he left a cup of milk by her door. In the morning, it was gone. Maybelline did not speak of where she'd come from. He didn't ask. But sometimes he caught her staring off toward the tree line, eyes glassy, as if she were watching some version of herself that had wandered off into the woods and not come back. Her hands bore thin scars across the knuckles, the kind that told work done too young and too long. Once, he saw a burn mark near her collarbone, small but raw, as though someone had once punished her for standing too tall. In the town, their names were barely mentioned. The folks who had watched the auction whispered for a day or 2, then moved on, like cattle moving around a stump. No one visited the cabin. No one asked how they were doing. But Alma did. The old nurse came by every 2 weeks, delivering bundles of dried lavender and rabbit root, her eyesight dim, but her mind sharp as flint. She came for Thomas's rheumatism, though he never admitted to needing her. But this time, she asked to speak with the girl. "You don't have to answer me," Alma said, easing herself down onto the step beside Maybelline. "But I was once married to a man I didn't choose. That story ended in a scar and a fire. Yours doesn't have to." Maybelline didn't answer right away. Her fingers were wrapped around a mug of tea. She stared into it like someone reading a map. "He never touches me," she said finally. "Not even when I cry." Alma smiled, soft and slow. "Then you might have landed better than most." Later that evening, Thomas sat on the porch while the air turned to velvet and stars slipped into place one by one. Maybelline came to stand beside him. She didn't sit, just leaned a shoulder against the beam, her arms crossed. "I don't want to go back," she said. "You don't have to," he replied. She nodded. That was all. The next morning, she was humming. Not loud, not sweet, just a few worn notes, like wind turning through chimes. Thomas paused in the doorway to listen. She didn't know he was there. She was folding linen, standing in the kitchen light that painted her hair gold. He didn't say anything, just turned back into the yard and went to work fixing the gate where the hinge had rusted through. That week, Maybelline began tending the little patch of dirt behind the house. She worked it with a hand spade and her bare hands, moving stones, breaking clumps, whispering sometimes as she worked. One morning, Thomas found a thin green shoot had pushed through, already taller than it should have been. The garden began to grow. So did the quiet. They spoke more now, not of feelings, but of days. Whether rain would come. How many eggs the hen laid. If the coyote tracks near the shed were new or old. Once, she asked about the line of jars along the shelf, the ones filled with his late wife's preserves. He said they were hers. Maybelline didn't open them. Instead, she began making her own. Small things began to change. He noticed a red ribbon tied around the edge of the curtain, a small bird carved from pine resting on the mantel, her doing quiet and sure. His coat, which had lost a button weeks ago, reappeared on the peg with every button intact. He tried to thank her. She just shook her head and said, "It's what needs doing." Still, no one visited. No friends came to call. No neighbors offered bread or gossip. Their house stood like a stone on the edge of the prairie, forgotten, but whole. One evening, after a long day of splitting wood, Thomas returned to find Maybelline sitting by the fire. The bed was made. The kitchen was clean. But she was not working. She was simply sitting, a book in her lap, her face thoughtful. He paused in the doorway. "Do you ever think," she asked without looking up, "that maybe love doesn't come in thunder? Maybe it's just weather. Something that changes the shape of things slowly." He didn't answer. He didn't know how. But he stepped inside, took off his boots, and sat on the other side of the fire. They didn't speak for the rest of the night. But the silence was no longer heavy. It felt lived in, safe. That night, Maybelline set a second cup of milk by the hearth beside his. She didn't say why. He didn't ask. The fire burned low, and for the first time, he slept all the way through till morning. It would be easy to call it a marriage in name only, to say nothing bound them but law and proximity. But something deeper had taken root between them, something quiet and enduring, like moss on stone. They had not fallen in love. They had grown toward it, like vines reaching the same beam from different corners of the earth. And in that soft, invisible reaching, they found the beginning of something no one in town would ever speak of, but something as real and rooted as the land beneath their feet. The first rain came in mid-April, soft and steady like a hymn sung low. It didn't rush or roar, just soaked into the earth until the dust turned dark and fragrant and the air smelled of beginnings. The kind of rain that made things grow. Maybelline stood barefoot in the doorway, her hem damp, hands still streaked with soil. She watched the garden, the neat rows she'd bent over day after day, coaxing life from stubborn ground. Little green shoots reached upward now, tender but sure. The rain bent them but didn't break them. Thomas sat at the table behind her, repairing the worn leather of his saddle with thick, patient stitches. His eyes lifted once toward her, then back to the leather. There was no need to speak. She was becoming a constant in the frame of his days, like firelight or the wind through the cracks in the walls. That morning, they had worked side by side. She dug rows with her hands while he cut fence posts. At one point, their shoulders brushed. Neither stepped away. They were still learning each other in fragments. How she always dried her hands before handling anything soft. How he never wasted wood, not even splinters. How she hummed while grinding cornmeal. How he always left a space at the table for someone who wasn't there anymore. Later that week, she brought out a saddle of her own, small, aged, worn thin at the edges. It had belonged to her father, she said. She'd carried it from town to town, never letting it go. Thomas helped her oil the cracked leather, tightening the girth straps and reinforcing the stitching. Her hands worked fast, steady, familiar with tasks that once belonged to men. "You ride?" he asked. "Since I was tall enough to see over the pommel," she said, her lips tugging at the edge into something close to a smile. They saddled his gentlest mare and rode through the shallow stream bed just beyond the property. The mare liked her instantly, sensed her quiet steadiness. Thomas rode beside her, and for a time they didn't speak, just listened to hooves in wet grass and the caw of distant crows. When the sun reached its peak, they stopped near an old oak, and she dismounted with a fluid ease. He followed, unfastening the canteen from his belt, offering her the first drink. "This land," she said after a long sip, "it isn't easy." "No," he agreed, "but neither are we." She looked at him then, not quickly, not searching, just long enough to make something shift between them. A soft awareness, like warmth rising between two stones left in the sun. That evening, she made stew. The onions from town, dried beans, wild sage. He sat across from her, elbow on the table, watching the steam rise. It was the first time the house smelled like more than firewood. He asked her about her father. She told him about the creek they'd fished, how he taught her the call of every bird within 50 miles, how he used to press a hand to her back whenever she cried, not to hush her, but to say, "I'm still here." "He died when the snow came too early," she said. "We weren't ready. Ma had already gone, so it was just me and my sister." Thomas didn't ask what happened next. She didn't say. He reached across the table, slowly, and touched her hand. Not to comfort, not to fix, just to offer ground. Solid. Present. Her fingers curled slightly, then stayed. "I lost her too," he said after a while. "Not to snow. To fever." Silence sat between them. Not painful. Not awkward. Just true. Later, he brought out the fiddle he hadn't played since the funeral. She sat by the fire, knees pulled to her chest, listening. He didn't play well, but he played gently. The tune was a mountain lullaby, old as the hills, the kind sung to babies born during storms. When the last note faded, she was crying, but quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. He set the fiddle down and didn't speak. She wiped her cheeks with her sleeve and whispered, "I haven't felt safe in so long." "You are," he said. The days grew longer. The soil softened. Green things came fast, urgent, greedy for sun. Her carrots pushed higher. He built a trellis for the beans. They shared their chores without asking who would do what. She knew to cover the well at night. He always chopped extra wood if the sky turned gray. Eli came by sometimes, the orphan boy from the edge of town who'd taken to following Thomas on supply days. He brought stories and questions, and sometimes a bruised apple. Maybelline welcomed him with a firm kindness, never patronizing. "You talk to her like a real person," Eli said once to Thomas. "She is a real person," he replied. Eli nodded, as if that made perfect sense, though no one else had ever treated her that way. Alma returned with more herbs and a crooked grin. She watched the way Maybelline laughed now, briefly, but sincerely. She saw the tin cups beside the fire, always two now. She said nothing, only squeezed Maybelline's hand as she left. There was a moment in early May when Thomas found her sitting beneath the cottonwood tree where his wife was buried. She didn't say anything, just sat with her knees drawn up, hands in her lap. He joined her. The grave was marked with a simple stone. No words. She was kind, he said, and tired. Always tired. Maybelline nodded. I talk to her sometimes. He looked over, surprised. She listens, she said. Better than most. That evening, as they walked back to the house, Maybelline reached for his hand. It was the first time she touched him without sadness, without being held together by pain. And he let her. The next morning, she braided her hair and left her shawl hanging on the hook by the door. She stood taller, moved surer. She began singing more when she worked, old folk tunes with no known beginning, no known end. Thomas, for his part, felt something uncoil in his chest. Not joy, not yet, but the beginning of ease, of a home returning to itself. They never said the word love. Not once. It hung between them in unsaid things, in the way he took the stones from her path before she walked it, in the way she left fresh biscuits beside his tools. Then one morning, as the garden burst into yellow blossom, a rider came up the road. Maybelline stopped hanging laundry and stood very still, her hands damp with wash water. Thomas stepped out onto the porch. His eyes narrowed. The horseman wore a long duster and a crooked hat. His face was half-shadowed, but even from a distance, Maybelline knew him. Her past had returned. But she did not run. She did not cry. She said, steady as the soil beneath her feet, "His name is Frank Delaney." Thomas looked at her, not with questions, but with readiness. And for the first time since they'd met, she reached for his arm, not for balance, but to stand beside him. The wild things had grown. The roots were deep. And now the storm was coming. Frank Delaney arrived just before sundown, the kind of arrival that turned heads but left mouths shut. His horse was lean and sharp-eyed, like the man himself, and bore the marks of hard riding. He dismounted with a lazy arrogance, boots hitting the earth like declarations. The townsfolk watched from behind curtained windows and half-open saloon doors. No one welcomed him. He tied his horse near the well and looked around like he owned the dust. Thomas Lorne was standing outside the general store when he saw him. He did not speak, just watched the man stretch his back and brush dust from his coat with the confidence of someone who had not come to ask permission. Maybelline was not with Thomas. She was at the cabin, stringing beans along the new trellis, her dress caught in the breeze, hair tied back with the red ribbon she now wore often. The peace of her life had settled into her bones, but something in her still knew how to brace for a shadow. Frank asked for her by name, loud enough to be heard down the street, casual, like he was inquiring after an old pair of boots. "Maybelline still around?" he asked, to no one in particular. Heard she'd gone and gotten herself married to a ghost. Thomas stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "She's not here," he said. Frank turned, smiled thin. "You must be the widower, the one with the empty house and quiet eyes." Thomas didn't flinch. "If you're looking for trouble, keep writing." "Not looking for trouble," Frank said, lifting both hands as if in peace. "Looking for what's mine." "She's not yours." "She was," Frank said, stepping closer. "Back before she was auctioned off like a mule. Her uncle promised her to me. She was too proud to say yes, too poor to say no. You know how girls are." Thomas's jaw set, but his voice stayed even. "She's not a girl. She's a woman. And she made her choice." Frank chuckled, leaned in. "Did she now? After you bought her like a sack of feed? How noble of you." Thomas didn't rise to it. "You're not welcome here." "Funny," Frank said. "Didn't know you spoke for the whole damn town." "I speak for her." That night, Thomas returned home later than usual. Maybelline was on the porch, a candle flickering beside her. She looked up at him and knew without asking. "Frank," she said. He nodded. She didn't tremble, just sat straighter. What did he want? To stir up the past. She nodded again, slow and thoughtful. "He'll try to come here." "He already tried in town," Thomas said. "Words only, but they were pointed. Frank doesn't use fists first. He waits, builds fear like a fire." Thomas sat beside her. "I won't let him near you." She looked at him then, truly looked, as if seeing not the man he was, but the man who'd always been underneath. "You never made promises before," she said. "Not even when I asked." "I'm not promising revenge," he said. "Only safety." Her eyes softened, but her voice held firm. "I don't want to be hidden." I won't go back to shadows." "You won't have to," he said. The next morning, Frank rode out toward their land. Thomas met him at the gate. Maybelline stood behind the window, watching. Her heart did not pound. Her hands did not shake. The past was no longer a monster with teeth. It was just a man, smaller now than she remembered. Frank leaned on the gatepost, smiling like he belonged anywhere he stood. "Come make a call," he said, mock polite. Thought it neighborly. "You're not a neighbor," Thomas said. "I want to see her." "She doesn't want to see you." Frank chuckled. "She used to. Girl had fire. You ever see her with a knife? Quick as a fox. Shame what happens to fire when you cage it." Thomas stepped forward, closing the space. "You don't get to talk about her." Frank's eyes narrowed. "You think buying her gave you some high ground?" "I didn't buy her," Thomas said, voice steady. "I freed her. And she chose to stay." Frank spit in the dirt. "She's a woman who doesn't know what's good for her. Never did." "She knows exactly what she needs," came a voice from behind. Frank turned. Maybelline stood on the porch, arms folded, chin high. Not a girl anymore. Not afraid. She stepped down, walked past Thomas, and faced the man who once spoke over her, through her, never to her. "You don't get to haunt me," she said. "You don't get to carry my name in your mouth like something owed." Frank's face twitched. "You owe me." "I owe you nothing," she said. "Not one stitch. Not one scar." He moved toward her then, not fast, but with that same old lean she remembered, like he was bigger than his boots, like the world tilted in his favor. Before he could take another step, Eli appeared at the trellis, sling in hand. "Back off," the boy shouted. "You touch her, and I'll break your knee." Frank paused, eyes darting. From the barn, Alma stepped out, leaning on her cane. "You're outnumbered," she said. "And out of time." Frank's posture changed. The puff of power slipped from his shoulders. He looked around, really looked. Saw not just one man and a woman, but a home, a patch of soil, a web of people knit together not by law, but by care. "Wasn't worth the ride," he muttered, turning toward his horse. Maybelline didn't watch him leave. She turned back to the porch, to the man who hadn't raised a fist because he hadn't needed to. Thomas met her at the steps. "You all right?" She nodded. "It's done. He might come back." "If he does," she said, "he'll find I'm not where he left me." That night, as the sun melted behind the hills, Thomas lit the fire, and Maybelline placed 2 cups of milk beside it. They didn't speak of Frank again. There was no need. The past had knocked, been turned away, and the house still stood. Thomas reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. They sat close, not for warmth, but for knowing. Outside, the wild garden grew taller in the dark, leaves turned skyward, drinking every drop of quiet the night offered. Inside, a peace had been claimed, not given, not bought, but earned. The air was thick with the smell of new blossoms and wood smoke, the 2 scents weaving through the valley like old songs half remembered. Spring had rooted itself deep this time, refusing to let the land return to silence. The garden behind the cabin, once stubborn, brown, aching for life, had erupted into full green. Beans climbed high along the trellis, squash spread low and wide, and little wildflowers, uninvited but welcome, bloomed in the soft spaces between rows. They looked like confetti from some celebration no one had announced. Maybelline bent over the garden in the early light, sleeves rolled high, her skin browned by the sun and wind. Her hands, once tentative in the soil, moved with calm certainty now. She had memorized the rhythm of the land, and it had learned to trust her back. Her ribbon, faded red and soft from many washings, held her hair away from her face. It trailed behind her like a banner. Thomas was in the barn, working a new saddle tree, his fingers calloused but precise. He was whistling, low and tuneless, the kind of sound that said, "I am not alone anymore." Every morning for the past month, they had woken up together, not as lovers yet, not always as husband and wife, but as people bound by something deeper than ceremony. They shared breath, labor, silence. That was enough. But that morning, the wind shifted. It wasn't a storm wind, nothing sharp or angry in it, just a change. An edge to the breeze that hinted something long buried was walking up the road. The preacher came just before noon, his coat dusty, face weathered. He rode an old mule, slow and deliberate, and smiled as he dismounted. "Well now," he said, tipping his hat toward the porch where Thomas and Maybelline had just stepped out. "It's been a year since I last saw the two of you stand side by side." Thomas chuckled. "Didn't think we'd made much of an impression." The preacher nodded toward the garden. "Some routes take longer. Yours seem to have held." They invited him in, offered tea, and he accepted with the grace of someone who valued quiet more than stories. He sat, warmed his hands by the fire, and said, "Some folks think a marriage begins with a kiss, but it's the waking up to each other that makes it real." Maybelline met Thomas's eyes. There was no blush, just a weightless sort of warmth. The kind that says, "I see you. I choose you again." The preacher didn't stay long. He left with a jar of honey and a small bouquet Maybelline had pressed into his hand. "For your missus," she'd said, even though he'd never spoken of one. As the mule's hoofbeats faded, Thomas stepped closer, brushing a curl from her cheek. "You still feel like a stranger?" he asked. She leaned into his hand. "Sometimes. But not to you." That night, they walked to the cottonwood together. It was blooming, pale flowers brushing the air like feathers. She carried 2 candles. He carried the small fiddle. They sat in the hush and let the stars rise around them. Maybelline took a long breath, then said, "I used to think love was something you earned, something you had to work for so hard it nearly broke you." Thomas played a single note, then stilled the strings. "And now I think it's something that grows where it's safe." He nodded. "You made it safe for me." She touched his face then, both hands framing his jaw. "Then let's call it even." When she kissed him, it wasn't a first kiss, not really. It was the echo of every quiet moment they'd ever shared. Every cup of milk, every unspoken promise. It bloomed slowly, fully, without fire, but with light. They married again the next morning. No papers, no preacher, just the two of them, barefoot in the garden, under a sky the color of forgiveness. He wore his father's vest. She wore the same faded ribbon. Eli stood beside them, holding a ring Thomas had carved from bone. Alma was there, wrapped in her shawl, humming beneath her breath. Maybelline whispered her vows into the earth. Thomas whispered his into her hair. They sealed it not with a kiss, but with shared laughter as a chicken broke loose from the coop and chased Eli through the rows. The sun reached its peak, and the world held its breath. And then it exhaled. But that evening, just before the light broke entirely, a rider appeared at the edge of the ridge. Frank, not with bluster this time. No threats, no noise. Just a man with no more cards to play. He dismounted. Walked slow. He carried no weapon. Thomas moved to meet him at the fence. Maybelline stayed where she was, standing among the tall beans, her hands at her sides. Frank looked thinner now, dustier. Whatever fury had fed him had burned off in the ride. "I didn't come to take her," he said. "Not anymore." Thomas said nothing. Frank looked toward the cabin. "I've been thinking about the way things end, about what a man carries when he walks away." "She doesn't owe you a word," Thomas said. Frank nodded. "I know." There was a long silence. The wind tugged at the grass. "I wanted her to fear me," Frank said finally. "I thought that meant respect. I was wrong." Thomas kept his eyes on him. "She's free now," Frank added. "I see it. That's more than I ever gave her." He turned, walked back to his horse. Before mounting, he looked once more toward the garden. "She blooms now," he said softly. "Never did for me." He left without looking back. Thomas watched until the dust had settled. When he turned around, Maybelline was still in the garden, holding a sunflower in her hand. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling. But she looked more alive than she ever had. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. "He's part of the soil now." That night, the stars came early. They ate together by lantern light, spoke little, held hands beneath the table. When the last candle guttered out, they sat by the fire and listened to it crackle. Maybelline rested her head on his shoulder. "It feels done," she said. Thomas pressed a kiss to her hair. "It feels like the start." Outside, the wind turned warm, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the last shadow of the past folded itself into the night. They made love not as salvation, not as escape, but as two people who had earned each other. Their bodies moved slow, reverent, as though touching was an act of planting. In the morning, he rose first, lit the stove, poured 2 cups of milk. She came to stand behind him, arms around his waist. "We didn't need saving," she whispered. "Just space to grow." And from the trees outside, a bird called its first song of the season. Before the sun went down that day, Thomas carved a second name into the porch rail, right beside his wife's. Not to erase her, but to let love grow again where once it had withered. Maybelline traced the letters with her fingertip, then kissed them softly. They stood there a long time, as the light bled across the hills like honey. And when it faded, they turned inward, not away from the world, but toward each other. The story didn't end there. It never does. Some love stories don't begin with lightning or end with fire. Some simply bloom, quietly, where wild things grow.